You're listening to Life Repurposed with Michelle Rayburn, where you'll find uplifting and practical advice for everyday living, creative inspiration for do-it-yourself projects, and recommendations for books and resources that will encourage you to embrace your life repurposed. I'm your host, Michelle Rayburn. Welcome to episode number 24 of the Life Repurposed podcast. We are in a brand new year and a brand new decade, and I'm launching the year with some news about this podcast as well as some reflections about the last year. If you have been a longtime listener, thank you so much for being with me over last year for all of the episodes that came out in my very first year of this podcast. And now we're launching into year number 2, and I've decided to make some changes. So I'm about to tell you about those. Don't worry, I hope that the things you love aren't going away, but I do have some new things to add in. So just over a year ago, I launched the Life Repurposed podcast, and my intent was and will always be to inspire others to find joy in the middle of the not-so-fun stuff in life. And I also want them to challenge themselves toward change if they aren't happy with the status quo. And I hope that each listener will discover helpful resources that would encourage them to grow and change. So in the last year, I covered topics about setting goals and simplifying. I talked about decluttering. I talked about health. And I talked about some of my own challenges, especially with making time for self-care in the busyness of everyday life. So I'm still working on the rest of my plan for 2020 for this podcast, but I'm working on being more intentional about what I share with you. So I'll still include my own personal experience. I will give tips and resources. But here is some of the news about what's coming up in 2020 and what's on the docket for change. So first, I'm going to include bonus videos here and there on my Facebook page, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes. You'll find the show notes for this episode at michellerayburn.com/24. But from this point going forward, regular episodes will be podcast and audio only. And by taking the extra time that it takes to produce that video away from my schedule, it will lead me to some other exciting changes that I'm able to do. So thank you for those who have joined on YouTube and on Facebook video. And I promise it isn't the end of video, but for the weekly episodes, it's important for me to be able to produce them in a timely way and get the content out to you. So that leads to the number 2 change, but I just kind of gave it away a little bit with that one. I'm going to produce more episodes. Instead of being just twice a month right now, I'm going to produce weekly episodes. That's going to give you a little bit more content, and it's going to allow me to bring on more guests and stuff like that. So the next one really isn't a change, but it goes along with the first 2 that I just shared with you. I'm going to stick to episodes that are around 15 minutes long as often as possible. And I know a few of them last time went over. Some were 30 minutes, some were 40. I know that you're busy, and I'm a podcast listener too. Your life is crazy, and if you're like me, you have only a few minutes here and there while like styling your hair, riding in the car, having a few minutes in a waiting room, whatever it is. If you're like me, you only have a few minutes to listen here and there, and you just don't have time for podcasts that take an hour. Me either. I love some of the content that's on them, but I don't get to listen to all of them because there's just too much stuff. So I want Life Repurposed to be short and punchy and packed with something practical for you. Okay, number 4, I have moved to a new hosting platform, which allows me to share much better show notes with you right on the podcast pages, which live on my blog. Now, for some of you, nothing has changed because you can still download the episodes from the same places you've always downloaded them. It's just that if you ever click through to show notes to get links, then you will know that you have a couple of extra clicks to do, and now those links should go direct to the blog. So if you have trouble with that, be patient because I'm still experimenting and still learning the new platform. You'll find links to any resources that I mentioned in an episode on those blog posts so that later you can hop on and grab the info. So if you're in the car, I do not want you to get out paper and try to take notes. I do care about your safety very much. You're welcome. So when you're free later, just go onto my blog and get the show notes. Each time it's just michellerayburn.com/ and then the episode number. So it's really easy to do that. I'll say the episode number a few times in each episode. Number 5, I also alluded to this a second ago. Having more episodes means I can include more guests as long as their content fits my audience. So I'm always looking for people who would be able to come on and share a word of encouragement and some practical tips for you, my listeners. And then finally, each episode will still have the 3 sections that include Inspired Life, which is just a topic that touches on practical issues. We'll have Life Repurposed, which is either a story about how someone pressed forward despite their challenges, or it could be practical tips to help you see your circumstances in a new way. So that's nothing new. And then we'll still have resources, which could be books, articles, episodes of other podcasts that I've curated for you that go along with the topic. So as we think about 2019, thinking back a little bit, I'm reflecting on the goals that I did get done and the ones that I didn't. This podcast was one that I did get done, but then I didn't get as many episodes done as I wanted to have. And maybe you have some goals like that, where you set goals and then they just didn't 100% come to fruition in the last year. I set goals, but I hold them loosely. So the last week of December, for some of you, could be a guilt week. If all of the unfinished stuff from the year came crashing in your brain and you were thinking and running through it and you had this realization that I just didn't do all the things that I wanted to do. I don't want you to feel like a failure, because when we do that review of the year, it isn't about shaming ourselves, but it's really on focusing on looking back and seeing what we learned and then looking forward to see where we're going. So let's talk about what to do if you didn't come close to the outcome you had hoped for in the last year, and then we'll look at what you can do about that in 2020. In the next episode, I'm going to give you a behind-the-scenes look at my own evaluation of goals. So we'll talk about that in the next one. But here are some questions for you to ask yourself as you begin a new year and you debate a little bit about what to do about goals. And I'll talk more a little bit in the next episode about whether I'm going to set goals this year or how I'm going to do that, because there's so many different ways. And some of you are super detailed in how you do that. And you might even have a whole day where you sat down and planned goals. And then when you look back, you sometimes go through and review, and then you can, either celebrate or look at what you didn't get done. But what I want to do right now is give you a couple questions to ask yourself as you look at your goals from last year. So number 1, did something unexpected come up that interrupted your plans? I have friends that went through losing a home to a flood. They had health crises. Some moved across the country. Some lost a spouse, lost a job, or more. Rather than tackling their goals, their main goal in life is picking up the pieces and moving forward from whatever happened. Repurposing is about taking a new direction when you need to. You had no way of knowing last January what was going to happen in the year. So keep that in mind as you loosely look at your ideas for 2020 as well, knowing that you don't know exactly what's going to happen in this year. Number 2, did you accomplish something you didn't expect you would? I had a couple of huge freelance projects last year that weren't on my radar in January at all. I had no idea I'd be doing them. They were wonderful and I loved doing them, but they did change my goals. So I had to bump the completion of my current book into 2020 instead of publishing it by the end of December, even though that was my goal. And I'm a person who gets stuff done, and it wasn't that I was simply procrastinating. I had to shuffle things around a bit. Number 3, did you learn something about yourself last year that stretched you and made you a better or stronger person? Give yourself a pat on the back for personal growth if that was you, because maybe changing your goals midway was part of a personal growth process. So that's a goal that was achieved as well too, even if it wasn't on your list. Number 4, did you let go of a goal when you realized it was not only unrealistic, but also not in your best interest? I once let go of a whole career for this reason, but that wasn't in my 5-year plan when I started the career. And I've talked about it before, and I know I'll talk about it in the future again on another podcast. But when I realized that it was not for me, I didn't just keep charging ahead and going forward with it, knowing that it just wasn't satisfying and fulfilling. Number 5, did you make excuses when you had no reason for not achieving your goals? Now, this is if you had no reason, okay, for not achieving your goals. Did you make excuses that weren't actually roadblocks? I do this too. I have definitely done it. Sometimes I think I have no time, and then I realize I actually have simply chosen not to use it wisely. Or I've chosen to use it in a way that took me in a new direction and distracted me. So it's really important, rather than shaming yourself, if you're looking back and you're saying, I had the time, I could have done it, I just didn't. Let's not shame you for that. Let's just make the best of it and figure out what you're going to do different in 2020. So we're going to use it as a springboard for change. Finally, number 6, were your goals based on what you thought they should be rather than what you really wanted them to be? Were they based on what you thought they should be or what you wanted them to be? Now, I ask that because, again, I had a career I pursued because I thought I should, based on what my high school guidance counselor told me, what other people said, and I thought, I'm good at this, so I can do it. But I'm not sorry for what I learned in taking that direction, even though I got to a point where I realized this isn't the right thing for me. But as soon as I realized it wasn't right for me, I made a change. And even then, there were other people who still had an idea of what I should do and were trying to counsel me on my next step. So I did talk about something related to this in an episode called Friend or Fixer. That is at michellerayburn.com/14. That was episode number 14, where I talked about getting rid of telling each other what we should do. So those are some questions for you to reflect on. Now, in the next episode, we'll walk through how I evaluated my goals from last year. And in the meantime, I'm going to give you a couple resources that I mentioned over the last year because I still recommend these for working on goals. And I think it'll help you get launched in this year as you start to think about what do you think you want to have happen in 2020. So as we wrap up with some resources, I want to remind you that in episode 6, To Goal or Not to Goal, I talked about a book from Michael Hyatt called Your Best Year Ever, a 5-Step Plan for Achieving Your Most Important Goals. And if you haven't listened to that, you can go all the way back in the podcast and listen to episode number 6, where I talk about that a little bit. But I had just started reading it then, and that was early on in 2019. And so I completed that book and applied some of the things that I learned there. So I still want you to go back if you hadn't checked out that resource before. Michael Hyatt has some resources in the book too, where you can find a link on his website to work through setting goals and use some of the tools he has there. There's even a little mini course on his website. So in the show notes, I will have a link for you to get the book if you didn't get that yet, or find Michael's resources. And if you want to listen to Goal or Not to Goal, that is at michellerayburn.com/6. So again, the link will be for you there. Another resource that I mentioned in the past year was Atomic Habits by James Clear. And that was in episode 10, michellerayburn.com/10, where I talked about procrastination. And that is something that has changed a lot for me, where I used to procrastinate so much more than I do now. I still have days where I know I'm supposed to be doing something, and I know I need every moment that I have to get it done, and yet I'm still browsing the internet or doing something that I know isn't productive. So all of us have moments, okay? So I don't want you to think I'm perfect and polished and I get it all right, but I've made strides. And so I resonated with so much in Atomic Habits, and yet I read it and then I put it aside, and then I had highlighted so much and then I forgot about half the things that I read. So I know I'm going to get it out and flip through it and find those highlighted points and just review it. I also heard him recently on a podcast episode with Amy Porterfield, and so I'm going to link to that in the show notes so that you can listen to an interview with him. He was also on another podcast that I listened to earlier in the year. So I'll give you some of those links where you can find some interviews. But in Atomic Habits, James Clear addresses how habits are formed one increment at a time. And he talks about the accumulation of choices that leads to a habit that then leads to accomplishing a goal. And he teaches how to make actions obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying in order to establish a new good habit. So we remove the obstacles, we leave things out, we put them in an obvious place. We make it so that we set ourselves up for success. And then on the flip side, he talks about how to break a bad habit by doing exactly the opposite, making something invisible, unattractive, difficult, and unsatisfying. Now, here's a really easy example of that. If you've ever battled with chocolate, you know how this principle can work. So let's say you're trying to replace carrots for chocolate. So you put the carrots out, you cut them up and you make them easy to get to in the refrigerator so you don't have to peel them and cut them. They're all ready to go. They're the first thing you see when you open the refrigerator door and you can grab them for a snack. And then the thing you're trying to remove or have less of, let's say it's chocolate. Darn, I love chocolate, but I do have to do this sometimes. I have to move it way up on the top of a shelf so that I have to actually get out a step stool to get to it. I have to put it out of sight so that if I get something else out of that cabinet, I don't see it. And just by making it more difficult and unsatisfying, well, I don't know if chocolate's ever unsatisfying, but you get the idea. By putting it out of sight and out of mind, I make it much harder for me to just fall to that temptation. So this applies to our work, our schedule, our habits for exercise, our sleep, all these things. So I'll link to the book. I'll link to other interviews. I don't want this to get too long. Like I said, I promised I'll keep them short. So this week, as I leave you, I want to encourage you to ask yourself a question. Okay, 2 questions, okay? First, what goals didn't I reach this past year? I just want you to think, which ones did I want to reach that I didn't? And number 2, why didn't I achieve them? Go back to some of the questions I asked at the beginning here and just ask yourself why you didn't get there. That'll prepare you for next week. I want you to come back when I give you a secret look at what I set for goals last year, and I'm going to tell you how I did on accomplishing those. The show notes for this episode are found at michellerayburn.com/24, and I'll see you next week. You've been listening to Life Repurposed with Michelle Rayburn. Check out tips, resources, and inspiration at michellerayburn.com. I'd love it also if you would subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, iHeartRadio, or Spotify. I'd also love it if you would like, review, and share the information about this podcast with your friends. Thank you so much for listening.